Buddy, HP Holo here, back to continue my Facebook Live reading from The Wizard's Way. Today I will be reading from Chapter 1 and pausing every now and then to give you, I think the film actually just started in a weird place, so I'm just going to continue, or rather begin again. So hello everyone, I am back, HP Holo here to continue my read. Hello Nova, Nova's here too. My Facebook Live reading from The Wizard's Way. Today I'm going to read from Chapter 1 and pause every now and then to give you some insight into what I was thinking when I wrote certain parts of the chapter. So here we go. Chapter 1, J. Chauncey Thatcher. There was a man hanging by his neck, and it had nothing to do with the festival. He dangled from an iron wand in the center of the city park, a black sack covering his head, painted with haunting white eyes and a jagged grin. From his neck, in equally jagged script, hung a sign reading Wizard. Chauncey could see it plainly from his desk or workshop roof. He saw people in the park pass by, look up, but then continue on with their morning constitutionals. They were in no hurry to take it down. He'd brought an apple and some cheese up for breakfast with a view, but not that view, and certainly not this week. J. Chauncey Thatcher would turn 18 in 7 days. The thought rose upon him like the sun on an execution morning. It was not hyperbole. It was fear, deep, cold-bellied fear that in 1 week he'd receive a letter from the Queen that was tantamount to this wizard's fate. Something clawed inside him. It was why, as he bolted out of his workshop, his singular thought was this: what the hell? I'm gonna fight a bear, and then I'm gonna jump. Evolution had first intended the bear's claws to swat holes in its prey, but at the moment they were occupied by the pages of a book. Behind the bearman loomed a great iron gate wrought into leafy curls and barky branches in imitation of the surrounding greenery. The way he positioned himself before the gate, feet planted wide, chest puffed and bold, shoulders back, suggested that he was meant to be guarding it. However, the measured relish with which he absorbed the pages suggested that he sensed few threats against which to guard. That is, until his nostrils twitched, and the scent that carried through them— oh, my cat is stepping on the keyboard. Stop it, Nova. Okay. And I lost my place. Da, 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 da. Okay. However, the measured relish with which he absorbed the pages suggested that he sensed few threats against which to guard. That is, until his nostrils twitched, and the scent that carried through them drew him to quick attention. As a bearman, he prided himself on the acuteness of his sense of smell. He could pick a wily Grimhawk dame from a flock of corseted Iron City ladies miles below in Arling Park simply by the scent of sea salt and citrus in her hair. He could identify and trail a cutpurse on the distinct tang of his fright alone. In fact, he could distinguish the nervous fear of a burglar from the exhilarated fear of a schoolboy about to swipe a candy on a dare. All humans carried particular scents to which their own noses were oblivious. He tested the air again, the crisp evergreen, the open mountain air, the distant coal-fueled choke of industry, and ooh, candied nuts! The festival dealers had opened. But mingled with these scents of the Iron City, he detected one very particular smell. Aged wood, absorbed from a sixth Horus building, no doubt. Mechanical grease. The cool nip of iron. Sweat. A musky cologne applied to cover the scent of sweat. The earthy, mineral smell of underground. And not a single nip of fear. He'd encountered this scent before. Of course, his nose being incredibly acute, he could not yet see the person to whom it belonged, so he returned to his book. 15 minutes later, he tried to look surprised when 2 human feet stomped up to his own. "I demand entrance to the Crystal Heights," the feet said. The bear clapped his book shut, as if startled from a trance, and then peered down over his half-moon spectacles. Before him stood a boy as thin as kindling, face firm in a scowl that was clearly unaware of his own size, or the bear's, or the relation between the two, or didn't care. The boy locked his dark eyebrows in a practiced glare and planted one foot on top of the wooden box he'd wheeled along with him. This gave him the look of having conquered something, but his physique interfered with his intentions, for he had very much yet to grow into himself. His bare forearms crossed his chest like 2 toothpicks over a half-eaten sandwich. A very impudent sandwich, and one that was plainly searching for trouble. The bear guard put on his widest, toothiest grin. "James Chauncey Thatcher!" he exclaimed. "Why, it's been months! You know, it's been so quiet since you were put away that I've almost caught up with the tales of Ambrist." He gestured toward his book. "I've no time to banter with you today, Vanderlyn," the boy stated. "I must enter the Heights as soon as possible. It's urgent." "Did you say banter?" Vanderlyn said. "You're using smart words today. You must be up to some mischief." "What?" the boy snapped. "The only time you ever put your vocabulary to use is when you're trying to pick fights with people. Otherwise, you'd just say, 'I don't have time to talk, Mr. Vanderlyn. I'm late for tea.'" Usually Vanderlyn's voice came in a deep alveolar grumble, not because he was actually grumbling, but because that was how bear mouths handled words invented for human mouths. When he attempted Chauncey's voice, it became a high, reedy thing, like it might have come from a talking squirrel. "I do not sound like that," Chauncey objected. Which was true, Vanderlyn admitted. The boy's unruly puff of hair and burgeoning sideburns gave him the look of a small lion that hadn't grown into his mane yet. That was what he sounded like. A mewling cub that hadn't aged into his roar. "And I am never late for tea," Chauncey clipped. "However, I do have urgent business to attend to that needs to be handled soon." Mr. Vanderlyn crossed his arms over his chest. "When a scruffy thing like you says he's up to urgent business, I'm inclined to think he's up to no good. Especially when he's got an odd-looking box with him, and especially when his wrists are still raw from the Queen's shackles." The boy shrank at that. He twitched to hide his reddened wrists, but decided against it, and instead he planted his arms firmly akimbo where the wrists were clear. "Really, boy, it surprises me that Inspector Ashton hasn't made you your own custom pair by this point. You're such a regular in the tunnels." "My record has nothing to do with today's task," Chauncey groused. "And how can you call me scruffy? You're a bear." "A bear who knows how to dress properly for the high districts," Vanderlyn countered, gesturing along his attire with a dainty flourish. "You will observe my finely tailored wasps and fandy-faced waistcoat, neatly pressed dress shirt, and staunchly starched collar, complete with silk cravat with a lovely floral design to match my gait. I thought of that last touch myself, by the way. You, on the other hand, look like you were just belched out of the cauldron and smell like a pile of wet dogman's underwear. In fact, take a mint, boy." Vanderlyn reached into his waistcoat pocket. "I'm not sure what you're on about with that smell of yours, but it could stand to be a bit more pleasant." "It's not that bad," Chauncey countered. "Burgle. To a human, not to a human," Vanderlyn replied, as he opened a paw-sized tin. "To a bearman, your scent is a distraction. Here." With 2 claws, he plucked a white mint from the tin and placed it in Chauncey's begrudging palm, which fell under the weight of it. For a bear mouth, the mint was perfectly sized. For a human, it was the size of a large biscuit. "This won't even fit in my mouth," Chauncey stated. "Then at least rub it on your clothes or in your armpits or somewhere," Vanderlyn responded. "Anyway, it's all further reason not to admit you into the Heights. You've made so many bad fashion choices today that I'm not sure I can trust you to choose more wisely on any more complex decisions you might have to make." "I wore a cravat," Chauncey defended, puffing out his neckcloth. "A cravat alone does not a gentleman make," Vanderlyn argued, "especially when he doesn't even have the decency to wear a clean suit with it. You're not even wearing a jacket, boy. You may as well be naked by human standards. That's even more reason not to let you into the Heights unpermitted." "Unpermitted?" Chauncey puffed up his chest. "My employer should have secured permission through Arthur Maberly." "I've received nothing from Lord Maberly today, or Charles Farwood for that matter." "Check your envelopes." "I already checked them this morning." "Then check again. Farwood should have sent a message." "Charles Farwood should do lots of things that he doesn't," Vanderlyn grumped. But then he rolled his eyes and brought a stack of envelopes from a pocket. He made a show of examining each letter, taking it gingerly between 2 long claws, drawing it to his spectacles for closer examination, then raising it into a nearby sunbeam for further scrutiny, as if it held a message only discernible by sunlight. "Eat your mint, boy. That's a Bernia mint," he said as he reviewed each letter. Chauncey broke off a chip, as commanded, and kept his eyes on Vanderlyn. Okay, this chapter is actually a perfect example of how my writing process works, which is to say that sometimes I just throw ideas in to see what sticks. The details that don't get developed by the end of the book usually end up being cut out in the early semi-final editing stages. But sometimes the random ideas that I insert develop in such a way that they end up being pivotal to the book, And in this case, the bears and Tales of Amberest became two of those things. The entire Brunel, that is Bearman culture, wasn't even in my outline for this book, or for this version of the book at least. But when I was writing this chapter, I needed a guard of some sort to be Chaucy's obstacle in this scene. And it wasn't really exciting for me to write just a generic guard. And so I started thinking about ways that I could make this particular guard in this particular scene stand out. Now, at the time, I was doing a lot of writing in Asheville, North Carolina, and lots of hiking trails, lots of bear warnings around the hiking trails. And so, naturally, I thought, you know what? I'll just put a bear in and see what happens. So, we're going to have a bear guard. And Asheville itself was actually a very loose inspiration for the Iron City in general. I knew when I began writing The Wizard's Way that I didn't want to use a traditional, dreary, foggy British London setting because personally I hate that kind of weather. But Jacob says I am sun or solar powered, and it's very true. Rain just makes me want to take a nap all day and not do anything. But because of that, I knew I didn't want to write a whole book set in dreary weather. But also because that type of setting is so prevalent in steampunk, I just wanted to avoid it in general because we already see so much of it. I also like just greenery and trees and things, and when I was traveling through Asheville, I just became enamored by the beauty of the mountains, but especially some of the crazy architecture that just shows up around the really rugged parts, like just these random solidly built houses just planted on the random side of a mountain with like 100-foot cliff drop right next to it, and it's just the sort of visual appeal made it stick in my mind, and so I took that and was like, what if I just do a whole city of that? Just a whole city of houses planted in crazy places, sprawled up the side of a mountain just against all odds with really clever architectural quirks to make it work, and you'll see some of those quirks in the next part of the chapter. That is typically a thing that I do when I write. I take a little thing that I like and I make it bigger and more ridiculous in my writing. It's also why in the next section of the chapter, there's an area of the Iron City that is literally just all fancy tree houses, because I love tree houses, and I don't have enough, like, I don't even have a tree in my backyard that's big enough to house even a little kitty tree house. But you know what? I write, and that's kind of a fun replacement for things that I can't do in real life. Anyway, back to my original point, which was bears. Because of this scene, bears are now an essential part of the world in the Wizard's Way and the Wizard Circus, which I'm working on. All just because I wanted a single memorable guard. But then once I had a bear in the story, I naturally did some research on bears to mine for little quirks that I could add to Banderlin and eventually to the culture, which is why in the next section, or I actually you've already seen a little bit of it, Banderlin has fancy artisan mints, because bears are, they're attracted to mint-like scents. They like mint. It's also why in the next section he hates the smell of fabric softener, though I will say, I will add that while I was doing my bear research, there were several hiking pages and forums that were like, you know what, to keep bears away from your campsite, you should totally put some fabric softener in your stuff because they don't like that smell. And animals in general don't like that smell. But on the flip side, there were others that said, you know what, bears are curious and they might actually be drawn to your campsite because of this interesting, strong, definitely not natural smell. All this to say, talking bears are different from actual bears, so don't take any advice in this book that you see on keeping bears away. But yeah, I also made the upcoming fabric softener smell like lavender because I hate lavender. I do think lavender is actually one of the things that can attract bears, so again, don't take any of my advice on keeping bears away. Yeah, so I'm going to continue with the next part of the chapter. This is from Chaucy's perspective. There wouldn't be a forward letter. There was supposed to be a forward letter. There were always supposed to be forward letters, but if forward could be relied on for anything, it was to make life difficult for his apprentice. This was why Chaucy and Banderlin knew each other so well that Banderlin would give him expensive Burnia mints, and why Chaucy knew that, despite their familiarity, Banderlin would soon tire of the distraction he provided. It was why he knew several alternate routes into the heights, all of them impossible today. This in turn was why he recognized that the gate he wanted to pass was only a little bit taller than the bear blocking it, why he knew that the bear's shoulder would make an excellent step if he could reach it, and why he'd brought this particular box in the first place. It was not the cleverest of his plans, but it was quick, or would be if he timed everything correctly, and, he now noted, very possible, if he could just get Vanderlyn to back up another foot. Chaucy popped the mint chip into his mouth. None, Vanderlyn confirmed, returning the letters to his pocket. Chaucy slumped into a sigh as if he'd heard the most depressing news of his life. Could I bribe you, then? He reached into his trouser pockets and inched the box forward. Bribe, laughed Vanderlyn. That's uncharacteristic of you. Inch. I could bring you a fish from Arling Park Lake, Chaucy offered. Inch. Ah, do they stock salmon lightly dusted with dill and lemon now? Inch, inch. No, they stock fish, the wet kind, still wriggling. Inch, inch, inch. Vanderlyn's eyes widened as if scandalized. Surely you don't mean to imply that I'm heathen enough to eat my fish live? The box tapped against his clawed toe, and instinctively the bearman stepped back. I've seen the other bearmen do it, Chaucy said as he hopped onto his box. Yes, with the assistance of Vanderlyn's forearms, he could make the leap from here. Yes, but they're not as civilized as I... Vanderlyn didn't finish. Chaucy pulled one hand from his pocket and bashed it straight into the bearman's nose. He launched from the box, leapt to the bear's shoulders, and cleared the gate. Almost. Just as he passed Vanderlyn's head, a great fleshy paw whomped into his face and thwapped him down to the boards with a sickening crack. The impact rang like a thunderclap in his head. Dark spots flickered across his vision, and a pervasive screeching whine rose in his ears. Still, through the addled ringing, he could hear the bearman bellow, "What is this devilish concoction?" It would have struck terror into Chaucy's heart had he not been looking for this reaction in the first place. Vanderlyn's arms flailed like furious windmill blades. His face squinched to such a pointed grimace around his nose that his gums were visible in an unintentional but no less comical snarl. This all centered upon a shiny purplish splat that soaked his snout and part of his waistcoat. He sneezed. A bubble blooped out of his nostrils. It was hard to be afraid of a sight like that, even in bear-struck addlement. It's emulsified soap and olive oil, Chaucy slurred. He tried to stand, but his legs were as wobbly as his tongue, and he collapsed face first onto the board. Don't talk science to me, boy. I am not in the mood for it, Vanderlyn roared. Chaucy propped himself up on his elbows and shook his head. Farwood's valet uses it to soften clothes. This substance is absolutely monstrous, barbaric, diabolical. It's fabric softener, Chaucy groaned. He shook his head again. Slight dizziness swam through his senses, but his vision had cleared and his ears had returned to normal. Good. He tried to stand again, this time successfully. Better. And then he crept forward, dragging the box behind him. It is a chemical weapon, Vanderlyn persisted. Ugh, this smell! It's not that bad, it's just flowery, Chaucy said, hoping Vanderlyn wouldn't notice that his voice now came from a different place. He crouched by the gate lock and reached into his waistcoat. You are not a bear, Vanderlyn continued. Your nose is 2,000 times inferior to mine. It is not just flowery. It is a lavender-scented weapon of unparalleled caliber. You're not even dying, Chaucy pointed out. Vanderlyn froze. What are you doing, boy? He growled, squinting to the place where Chaucy had been lying. From his pocket, Chaucy pulled a thin rectangular case, and from that he slid out a lockpick. Recovering, he said, clenching the pick in his teeth, checking for broken bones, same as I usually do when we meet. Next he slipped a little L-shaped tool from the case. Vanderlyn's ears twitched, listening. No, you're not. You've moved. Chaucy didn't bother answering. He knew it wasn't a trick that could last long, and Vanderlyn's paws were already inching around the gatewalk, orienting him where his eyes and nose could not. He wasn't even growling now. His ears flitted about in all directions, attentive. Chaucy had to move fast. He hooked the short end of the tension wrench into the bottom of the lock and slipped the lockpick over it. Gingerly, he clicked along the tumblers on the inside, seeking the pattern that would finagle the lock into compliance. Click, 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 click. His pick ran along the lock's tumblers. Click! He found it. He twisted the tension wrench. The lockpick snapped. Vanderlyn's ears sprung erect. A fierce huff of recognition sprayed from his snout. He whipped to face Chauncey's direction, a growl bubbling up in his throat, eyes burning red with fury and lavender-scented soap. He stomped forward. Chauncey yanked another lockpick from his case and jammed it into the gate lock. Click, 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 click. Vanderlyn's steps tromped heavy on the woodwork, slow, cautious, but bone-jarringly powerful. 3 more steps, and the bear would be on top of him. Click, 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 stomp, click, click. He turned the tension wrench. It gave, but not totally. Click, click, stomp, turn, clank. Chauncey flung the gate open, grabbed his box, and bolted. It was not long before a loud clang rang out behind him, followed by a satisfying clink and a fierce animal roar. "James Chauncey Thatcher!" Vanderlyn snarled. Chauncey had no reason to fear that snarl now. By the clang, clink, and roar that followed him, he guessed that Vanderlyn had smashed into the gate, closing and locking it with his girth. And though the bear had a key, he was still blind and impaired by the overwhelming scent of the fabric softener. He could chase Chauncey in that condition, but it wasn't advisable, for there was a reason why the heights were called the heights. The boards beneath his feet creaked and swayed at the whim of the mountain wind, and the wooden mansions that spread out and up from this road did so with careful, plotted eccentricity. Some were shaped like predictable polygons, as their foundations allowed, but others spiraled like whimsical labyrinths up and over several sets of foundations, as the mountain demanded, and they all looked to have trees sprouting out of their rooftops, because they did. Beneath the walk spread a great forest of massive oaks that had been alive since the beginning of the queendom, claimed by an ambitious set of Fourth Aurus architects, and then rendered comfortably habitable through an intricate system of bolts, flexible joints, and sliding beams braced to secure the mansions in relative place. Several hundred wooden houses lingered in the canopy of the mountain's forest, protected by the 100-foot drop that waited beneath them. No one in the Crystal Heights ran without knowing the edges, which was why Chauncey ran with brilliant confidence in his stride, and why his bones froze when he felt the walkway judder to the distinct, thudding rhythm of an ursine gallop. Vanderlyn was giving chase. Chauncey didn't bother looking back. He gathered every bit of spirit he had left into his legs and ran as best his box would allow. Vanderlyn barreled up behind, streamlined now on all fours. Chauncey strained his muscles and sprinted forward even faster. Ahead, the walkway split, branching into ramps both upward and downward, and from there it wove an ant's maze of artificial paths through the ancient trees. Chauncey dashed up. The slant of the run would be hard on his legs, but he needed to be high to make this worthwhile. The higher the better, where the view was clear and the fall was brutal, otherwise this would all be for naught. At the top of the slant, the forest canopy opened. Brilliant sunlight streamed onto the wooden walkway, and Chauncey's hand shot up to dull the shock of sun blindness. It was inconvenient, but Vanderlyn would suffer it too, worse with his irritated eyes, which might afford him some more time. He pressed forward, heart pounding, muscles burning. Other branching paths presented themselves, and he took them, the nearing chuff of Vanderlyn's breath drawing ever closer in his pounding ears. A few more ramps, just a few more ramps, and then he'd be high enough on the overlook of Lord Arthur Maberley. Then he would jump and be free of Vanderlyn's teeth. He ran harder, forcing his legs up the next incline, and was met with a stairway. Damn it, a stairway! He could clear the stairs under less dire circumstances, but he couldn't be slowed today. If he opted to thump the box up, Vanderlyn would be at the stairs before he could even reach the top. He stared at the city below. The view was clear. Some tents and wheeled vendors sprawled from the base of the mountain, but he could handle those when they were relevant. This was the best spot circumstances would allow, and now was as good a time as any. He flung the box to the ground and tore at its lid, just as a bear-shaped shadow rose over him and a cloth thrashed him to the ground. His face smacked hard into the wood. He rolled over and tried to scramble to his feet, blood spurting from his nostrils, but found himself pinned by one massive padded foot before he could even sit up. Chauncey clawed at the foot and shouted, "Get off me!" He meant it to be a snarl, but it squeaked out more broken and vulnerable than he'd intended. Perhaps hearing the strain of organs being crushed in the tone, Vanderlyn eased his foot off. Chauncey turned onto his side, groaning as a fresh stream of blood spilled from his nose onto the planks. Stop bleeding on everything, boy. Blood isn't fashionable in these parts. Chauncey tried to reply with an indifferent grunt, but in his condition it came out as a weak whimper. And stop your moaning, Vanderlyn snapped. You're a Calderling. You've survived worse than a mere slap. I must say, you've been uncharacteristically dumb today. Did you really think those shenanigans would work? Yes, Chauncey retorted. I don't do things unless I think they'll work. He propped himself up on one elbow and touched the back of his hand to his bleeding nose. Besides, I was out of quicker ideas. Ow! Figs, I think you broke my nose! I'm a bear. Did you expect a love tap? Here, let's see that. He crouched down to Chauncey's prone form and tweaked his nose between two delicate claws. No, it's still in place, he declared, then extended a paw. Chauncey took it, expecting to be pulled to his feet, but instead found himself flung across the bearman's shoulder like a sack of potatoes. Oof! Vanderlyn, what are you doing? I don't trust you to walk yourself, Vanderlyn replied, taking the box handle in his other paw. There's too much trouble you could get up to, walking. Put me down. I'll look stupid to anyone who sees. Well, you should have thought of that before you ruined my favorite waistcoat, Vanderlyn replied, beginning to canter down the walkway. You should be grateful, you know. For most men who rush me, looking stupid is the least of their worries. I go easy on you because you at least cause interesting trouble, and you've helped me find better ways to secure the heights. Glad to be of service, Chauncey clipped, and then twisted as best he could to face the bear's ear. Vanderlyn, you have to let me go today. It's important. Listen, I'll buy you all the fancy Bernia mints your heart desires. I'll even throw in a keg of Broonhead. Mints and mead, is it? How could I ever turn down an offer like that? A happy rise in the pitch of his voice gave Chauncey hope, but that dissolved when Vanderlyn continued, I will say I was disappointed in you today. Using your own stink to mask the lavender stench was clever, granted, but I'd expected a fancy machine to come into play, something more intricate than a lockpick anyway. Maybe a modified track hook for the trees or some equivalent. What's the matter with you today? What's the reason for all these hijinks? Cumulus congestus clouds, Chauncey said. You're talking science again, Vanderlyn stated. Towering cumulus, Chauncey clarified. He pointed toward a patch of sky that had earlier been blue, but was now punctuated by dark poofs that looked like foam billowing from the top of a freshly poured beer. They mean a storm is on its way, and bad weather will interfere with a thing I need to do today. What kind of thing? It's a surprise, Chauncey said lamely. It wouldn't be like the surprise you gave that Farrington prince's balloon last fall, would it? No, that was unintentional. It was still on fire, and it landed you 6 months of trap-finding labor, didn't it? That's why you have to let me go, Chauncey insisted. My birthday's this week. The Queen's gonna send her agents to see if I've satisfied the grace, and if I don't do something impressive, really impressive, to overshadow the mess with the prince, they're gonna send me back to the cauldron. Boy, they're not gonna send you back for that debacle. It's the combination of that and all the other things you've done that's the problem. Look at the facts. You've been out of the cauldron for 10 years and have spent 1 month for each of them sentenced to trap finding. I never committed any actual crimes, Chauncey objected, just badly timed accidents. That's what this next feat of yours is going to be too. A badly timed accident, whatever it is. No, it won't, Chauncey insisted. I've planned it down to the finest detail, and the conditions right now are perfect, and I'm trying to keep you out of trouble, boy, Vanderlyn barked. You're the first grace taker in years to even make it to 18, and all your disasters have at least happened in the pursuit of noble ambitions. I'm sure the Queen will take that into account too. This said, the Quincentennial Festival seems to be starting up. Go buy yourself some candied nuts and try to impress ladies at the carnival games. Keep yourself inconspicuous and worry about the grace later. I risk too much by doing nothing. Right now everyone thinks I'm just a polished ruffian with a lot of dangerous inventions. Vanderlyn snorted. Well, you are. I look it, Chauncey objected. When they look at me, they don't see that I've single-handedly run Farwood Shop, that I can read now, that I haven't stabbed anyone in 10 years. They just remember that I did stab someone, and that I'm from the cauldron. Let's be fair, Chauncey. You ravaged a whole gang, in self-defense, and set their base on fire, accidentally, when you were 7. People who aren't from the cauldron wouldn't understand, Chauncey objected. Besides, I haven't done anything like it since. But no one sees it that way, and that's my problem. Your problem, Vanderlyn stated, is that when someone tells you not to do something, you hear, find a different way to do it. which, I admit, is not always a character flaw and will serve you well in your line of work, but is nonetheless problematic when a person tells you not to trespass in private districts or not to test your improved fireworks in the city. Those fireworks work spectacularly, Chaucy objected. They just did it in a direction I hadn't intended. James Chaucy Thatcher, none of your catastrophic muck-ups are intentional, which is another of your problems. Ah, here we are. Where? Chaucy asked. He looked around at the surrounding treetops with their particularly dense branches, but didn't see anything otherwise exceptional about them. Do you think you've recovered? No dizziness, headaches, good coordination, steady on your legs? Sure. Why? Where are we? Vanderlyn didn't answer, but instead jolted Chaucy off his shoulder and caught the front of his shirt in his claw. I won't be taking you to the inspector today. So you're letting me go? Chaucy said hopefully. In a manner of speaking, Vanderlyn replied. Brace yourself. It was then that Chaucy noticed how close he was to the edge, and that he was moving closer. Oh, no, Vanderlyn, don't! Stop your whining, it's not like you're unaccustomed to this. And then he let Chaucy go. A cluster of trees, thick with age, whooshed up to swallow him like the walls of a tomb. Stripes of wide metal flashed by in empty air, and then the branches resumed. Their twigs thwacked against his face and cut his skin, but with a twist of determination, he turned himself to face the ground and grabbed at whatever branches his hands could reach. The first several broke under his velocity, but they also lessened it, and when a thick one struck him with a meaty thwap, he snatched hold and then clambered on to get his bearings. Just in time to hear the whish of his box zoom past. It crashed in the underbrush 50 feet below. Are you alive, boy? He heard Vanderlyn shout from above. Yes, Chaucy spat back. No thanks to you. You're a Calderling, Vanderlyn dismissed. You've survived worse. Chaucy had, but he wasn't about to give Vanderlyn the satisfaction of hearing him admit it. When he heard the creak of Vanderlyn walking away, he deflated against the branch. Residual bursts of terrified energy still coursed through his veins, so after making sure his important bones were whole, he made use of them and began his slow way down to the underoaks. Even if he'd wanted to climb back up, he couldn't. The trees closest to the walkway had been shaved of their upper branches and sleeved in wide ironed bands, making it impossible for the average climber to reach the heights from the ground beneath. They'd been put there to deter courageous thieves, but enhanced because of him, which was why some were barbed with poisoned spikes. This he'd learned the hard way. So he jumped, slid, and wrapped himself around branches until he made it to the mossy undergrowth. He found his box, and it looked undamaged. He'd built it hardy in anticipation of days like this, with a spring-supported inner box that would absorb sudden shocks in place of the contents. All the branches the box had broken during its descent had probably helped with the shocks too, and the mostly wooden parts inside would bend first before breaking, so his equipment was probably intact. Unfortunately, it was at the bottom of an old spiked war pit, which complicated things. He cursed the old Oricans for not filling in their war traps, but soon rigged a harness from some thick vines and recovered the box, no worse for the wear. It had crushed most of the rotting wooden spikes anyway. Now, with box in hand, he crawled out of the underbrush and hopped an iron fence onto a bricked street. Some passers-by gave him odd looks, but continued on in polite silence, and so he tidied himself as best he could, and began his trek back to the high districts. In Chapter 1. So, one of, I have notes here, and I have gotten them all out of order. So Chaucy and Vanderlyn, their relationship evolved really unexpectedly as I was writing this chapter. Vanderlyn, since he started out as, well, really a generic guard, was not supposed to be a factor in the novel beyond this scene, but as I wrote, or as I write in general, I often find that my characters write themselves to a certain extent, and the two ended up having such great rapport in this scene that I was like, you know what, Vanderlyn's a character now, I'll figure out how to use him, and he ended up playing a fairly significant role in later parts of the novel. And I actually came to use Vanderlyn as one of Chaucy's many, shall we say, father figures in this book and in the series as a whole, as I'm writing it now. Mr. Thatcher and Farwood being the other two. Eventually, Cider, who you'll meet in a few chapters, in the next book. And the thing about Chaucy is that he's not a bad kid, but he's determined and headstrong enough that it takes a lot of mentor figures to rein in his enthusiasm. And the fact that he requires a literal bear in his team of wranglers, to me, is just telling about his character, but also somewhat hilarious. And so I really love Banderlin is one of my favorite parts of this novel, precisely because he happened randomly and he ended up developing so well. Even though I hadn't planned him at all, which I mean tends to be how my writing works. The things I don't plan end up being the best parts of the novel. Um, so that is that for chapter 1. Thank you for watching, and I will be back sometime with chapter 2. So see you next time.